Hi, folks. So I'm just going to react now to the news that came out last night. I was watching ITV News actually, and they featured the government spokespeople announcing an extension to the current measures, allegedly to try and prevent the spread of COVID-19. And those measures include restricting how we can go out and socialize and making illegal any public gatherings of people. Um, so, any church meetings, any meetings in mosques, synagogues, temples, community groups, support groups, and of course, the more widespread ban, of course, on pubs, restaurants, cafes, fairs, fetes, all public gatherings to be continued to be illegal. And also to restrict the movements of individuals, how often they can go out and where they can go, and the closure of many businesses too. So the government have now announced that they want to extend this for the next 3 weeks. Well, we were all expecting that anyway. I'd already been primed for July, I think. That was widely speculated to be the date, but they didn't give any definitive timeline as to when that would end. In fact, what they did was give some conditions that would need to be met first before it would end, and I'll go through those in a moment just to see how justified those are. It was a spokesperson from the government featured on the news broadcast. I think his name was Dominic Raab, if it's pronounced right, and he's filling in for Boris Johnson, who's allegedly ill at the moment, allegedly with COVID-19. And Dominic Raab, the government spokesperson, had said, if we rush to relax the measures that we have in place, we would risk wasting all the sacrifices and all the progress that have been made. He's referring to the alleged progress and sacrifices of the measures that have been introduced. The ban in public meetings, in the restriction of socializing, in the individual's ability to go out. Well, that rests on an almighty assumption, in fact, that those measures have been justified and necessary and that they do make any kind of progress. Something that I think we should all question and examine and look for evidence to see whether that is justified and supported or not. Because there seems to be a lot of different evidence that's potentially disputable, and I'm going to come on to talk about that now. But the reason why I'm really concerned about this, to be honest, is that they didn't provide any firm evidence proving that those measures are necessary and justified. But more than that, they didn't really show any actual concern about the possible negative consequences of those measures. And I do have a reasonable concern about that in the short term, that there will be a certain amount of people that had already long-term psychosocial problems, that have had long-term mental health problems, and that those could easily be exacerbated with these measures of limited contact. You know, we're talking about people that may have been dependent upon social groups, support groups, prayer groups, that may have really needed that support, going out to visit a friend, joining a group, a therapy group of some sort each week. You know, whatever the type of group, there were many people that were quite dependent upon that. Now, I don't want to exaggerate the risks of that, and I think the overwhelming majority of people will probably manage okay. They might find it irritating, perhaps a little annoying. I know I have. But that in itself is mild, is trivial, and a casual concern almost. The two concerns I have are one, a limited number of people who already had long-term mental health problems, what effect that might have on severely restricting their social support networks. But in a second sense, a longer term problem, if these measures are to be extended more and more for potentially months or however much longer, what effect that could also have on the wider population, on other people too. The long-term effects of deprivation and of isolation of individuals is well known and studied in countless psychological assessments. You've only got to speak to former prisoners, people that have endured various times of isolation. You know that in prisons, the rate of self-harm, for example, is extremely high. Um, and it could well be that we see pathological consequences of long-term deprivation if that is allowed to continually be extended in the future. So I think we also need to consider what are the risks of continuing such measures, not just in the short term, where a minority will be affected a lot and a majority will be affected a little bit. But in the longer term, if such things were allowed to continue, potentially we could see pathological problems for a much larger segment of the population. You know, we could see anxiety disorders, addictions, alcoholism, drug abuse. We could see domestic violence, self-harm, depression, obsessive compulsive disorders, and numerous other affiliated psychological disorders that tend to be associated with long-term deprivation and isolation in general. So I think that is something worth bearing in mind when we are assessing and weighing up what are the risks and benefits of potential measures. And I was quite upset not to hear any kind of discussion of that within the announcements. And I think when we're looking at what are these sacrifices that are being made, to use the phrase that the government spokesman used, we need to assess whether they are first legitimate sacrifices, are they justified and absolutely necessary, and also what kind of harm and risks are they in the short term to a minority, but in the longer term possibly to a larger majority. So those are the two critical questions that I think do warrant being examined on closer inspection. Now, I don't want to make light of the COVID-19 strain of coronavirus. I know people have a lot of genuine concerns about the possible threat and the spread of infectious diseases, and I can quite understand those concerns, especially when it comes to other people with long-term pre-existing health conditions. And the overwhelming majority of people with COVID-19 or alleged to have that do have long-term pre-existing health conditions. So I do have my concerns about trying to limit the spread of that. I personally feel like many other virologists have stated that it would be much better to restrict the visitation of those with those chronic conditions and allow people with generally healthier immune systems to build up a stronger immune system, to build up an immunity to new viral infections, like we've done with previous influenzas and other viral infections we've encountered in the past. A herd immunity, therefore, whilst protecting and isolating a minority and doing the tests on the home carers and nurses and the family of those that are visiting and helping support those with the serious long-term health conditions. So I think those measures myself would be much better, but I think it's extremely over the top to such a terrible extent myself to lock up everybody and restrict entire populations. And I just don't see that the evidence so far has justified that. Now, the current death toll in the United Kingdom, estimated for COVID-19, is currently at 14,576, as of today at least. And that's of a reported 108,000 cases. But we don't know, of course, if that's the total number. We suspect there could be a larger number. Just because everybody's not being tested, of course, and people with mild to no symptoms or even moderate symptoms are probably not going to be tested. So we won't know the overall number of cases, and so we therefore also won't know the overall mortality rate of the COVID-19 strain of coronavirus. But of those 14,576 cases, at least of today, at least, on the 17th of April, I'm speaking, of those 14,500 cases, I would really question how many of those are only down to COVID-19. And there's a number of reasons that I do have concerns about that. There are guidance, regulations, or advice that's being given out now to doctors, advising them to record COVID-19 as the official death when they suspect that it is, when it's presumed to have been, without any official test actually confirming or corroborating that diagnosis. The legislation has also meant that one doctor alone can make that diagnosis without it being checked out by another doctor, without a secondary assessment being done, whereas it always had been previously. So if official advice is now recommending that only the mere presumption of COVID-19 is enough to record it as an actual death, then you wonder how many presumed cases of COVID-19 might actually be a different respiratory infectious disease, as many of them have quite similar symptoms. In fact, lots of viral infections will exhibit those feelings of being faint, of being tired, of excessive mucus, of having sweats, of having coughs, of colds, of flu-like symptoms, and many of them lead to pneumonia. Many infectious viral diseases do in fact lead to pneumonia, which kills about 3 million people globally each year. That's a very rough estimate. Coronaviruses normally make up 7 to 15% of the overall viral infections, in fact. So I would also want to know whether the tests done actually distinguish that particular COVID-19 strain from the other coronavirus infections, which are very common in each year anyway, and kill thousands of people each year. So I additionally have read that there are some cases, at least, of reported false positives occurring, where some of the test results are showing positive and then false when tested on the same person. And I've read a few reports of that. So I don't know, and I haven't studied enough to know what the true extent of false positives are and how accurate the tests are. But also, what role, if any, those actual tests are playing. If you consider, if it shows up that there is a strain of COVID-19, okay, but can we be sure of what role that is actually playing in the cause of somebody's death? Is it actually the sole cause? Is it just a contributor? Or is it actually laying dormant in the system and actually not playing any significant part at all? Well, there was a BBC article, and I'm quoting from a BBC article that says, "What the figures do not tell us is to what extent the virus is causing the death. It could be the major cause, a contributory factor, or simply present when they are dying of something else." That's a BBC article that admits that. Dr. John Lee, a professor of pathology, in a recent column for The Spectator stated, and I quote, Many UK health spokespersons have been careful to repeatedly say that the numbers quoted in the UK indicate death with the virus, not due to the virus." Okay, so we don't know whether it's an active participant and whether it's an active role that it's playing, or whether it's something like many other viral strains that happens to be within the body as a result of an earlier infection, but in actual fact, the death perhaps was due to other long-term health conditions. Well, the Italian studies, according to the ISS, the Italian Institute of Health, up to 99.2% of all alleged COVID-19 deaths could have been caused by pre-existing health conditions. The ISS report that those reported to die of COVID-19 were of a medium age of 80 years of age. That is very elderly. 10% were over 90 years of age, 90% were over 70. 75% of the deceased had two or more serious pre-existing health conditions. 50% had over three of these health conditions. Of 2,978 people studied, only 24 of those died without any serious pre-existing health conditions. So it's clear that an overwhelming majority of people reportedly dying, allegedly, of COVID-19 actually already have long-term health conditions. In a BBC article, an 18-year-old in Coventry tested positive for the coronavirus the day before he died and was reported as its youngest victim. At the time, the hospital subsequently released a statement saying his death had been due to significant health conditions and not connected to the virus. This statement given by the hospital was on March the 24th. Yet despite this, many tabloid newspapers still were referring to it as a coronavirus death almost a week later, as late as March the 31st. So as well as, a large number of other pre-existing health conditions that could easily be the sole cause, or at least a contributory cause, to the deaths, we also have presumed deaths being recorded as actual deaths. Indeed, that's the advice being given to doctors, that they can record something that's assumed to be COVID-19 without any necessity of tests proving that whatsoever. And indeed, also in America, a briefing note from the CDC, their National Vital Statistics Service, and it reads as, and I quote, "COVID-19 should be reported for all the deceased where the disease causes or is presumed to have caused or contributed to the death." Now that was given out as a recommendation on April the 3rd of this year, 2020. So basically stating, therefore, as advice to doctors, that something presumed to be COVID-19 can be recorded as an actual COVID-19 death. Now, we don't know how widespread that is. And given the nature of the symptoms, that they are so similar to so many other infectious diseases, so many other respiratory infectious diseases, one wonders just how many other viral infections could just be lumped in and labelled as COVID-19, because infectious diseases are quite common. Tens of thousands of people will die in the UK alone each year, over the course of a long period. Now, in 1 year alone, it was reported up to 25,000 people had died during a really bad epidemic. There was a particularly bad year a few years ago. There was a bad period of a flu outbreak. Well, we didn't react to any shutdowns or extreme measures for that, and that number of deaths was much higher than where we stand now. In fact, the BBC and the Daily Mail, they reported the excessive death figures due to a very bad outbreak of influenza in one winter season as being up to 50,000. Those numbers were somewhat disputed, in fact. We weren't sure quite how many of those were due to pneumonia and what kind of viral infection led to that pneumonia. But a much larger excessive number of deaths has occurred beforehand. So it's not unprecedented in that sense. We have had various epidemics in the past with